Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a deeper look at the most important or interesting aviation story of the past week with the AIN editor who covered it. I'm AIN News Editor Chad Trotvetter. This week, I'm joined by my colleague Kerry Lynch, who's been covering the aviation beat in Washington, D.C. for more than 25 years. With the new Biden administration in place, this is a good time to look for what's currently on the docket for aviation in the nation's capital, as well as what to watch out for in the coming weeks and months. So there's a lot going on in Washington with the new administration. So I hear we have a new FAA deputy administrator. So who's that, and what's going on at the FAA?
So yes, whenever you have a new administration come in, Chad, there's always a turnover in people. And, there were a number of high-profile resignations right before the inauguration, right after that, the attacks or the storming the Capitol, whatever you want to characterize it, on January 6th. So that left a little bit of vacuum in the leadership. Now, Steve Dixon, who is FAA administrator, carries over. He is in the middle of a 5-year term, and so that doesn't change. But the deputy administrator, who is a political appointee, not a confirmation appointee, but a political appointee nonetheless, turns over too. And Dan Elwell, who was closely tied to within the administration last year, had already said in October that he was not going to continue on. And he actually left in December. And I think he's set up his own consultancy and taken some assignments on a board. So a week ago, the White House appointed somebody named Bradley Mims to serve as the new deputy administrator. And he is not new to FAA. He served at FAA back in the Clinton administration, so in the 90s, and he served in DOT. He's got something like 40 years of transportation experience. Now, not all of it is aviation. There's, it's a cross section, so he comes at it with a different perspective. But he has served on some airport boards, and I believe he was involved in, was it AAA? He was involved in one of the airport associations, and I believe he was involved with MWA. So he's got a background. He knows airports, he knows infrastructure, he knows transportation, and this is a good year to have that background because infrastructure will be big this year.
So actually, let's talk about some of the bills that are in play in Congress. It's a new Congress, so they always have things that are on their agenda, and a lot of them are already being submitted. So there's some airport bills. You said there's some bills for aerospace manufacturers and the helicopter one as well, right, Kerry?
Yes. Okay. So Congress is getting right out the bat with legislation, and there have been, at least a handful of bills, and I'm sure there's many that I haven't even become aware of that are being dropped in, and a lot of them are holdovers from last year that were already introduced, and some of them that were actually acted on, and some are new initiatives. Sam Graves, who is the ranking Republican on the full House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, and Garrett Graves, who is the ranking Republican on the Aviation Subcommittee, no relation in case people are asking. One's from Louisiana, one's from Missouri. Jointly introduced a bill to make the whole purpose of the bill is to speed up airport projects because everything's infrastructure right now. And so what it's going to do is it's going to allow the use of AIP grants to provide for incentives for projects that get completed early. And they have to have some demonstrated benefit to capacity, efficiency, and actually show to have been completed earlier than on purpose. And there's limits to it and everything. But that's a bill that actually passed the House. It did not get acted on in the Senate. But it was pretty non-controversial. So that has a pretty good chance of moving through. Maybe not as an independent bill, but it might get attached to something. Representative Rick Larson, who runs the Aviation Subcommittee as chairman, and he's a a Democrat from Washington, reintroduced legislation to provide these public-private partnerships to cover the costs of aerospace worker salaries. And that's to prevent layoffs in the manufacturing sector. So we've gotten all sorts of aid for small businesses to cover salaries through the last two coronavirus relief bills. We've gotten aid for air carriers and their subcontractors, and we've gotten small business grants. But what we haven't gotten was grants aimed at the manufacturing sector. And as we all know, manufacturing in 2020 was down, I don't know, 30%. And that's just in business aviation, probably even more so in the commercial aviation sector. So that's going to result in layoffs, and there have been. So the point is to keep the manufacturing segment. And it's not just the big airframers. We're talking down the supply chain too, because, one of the big issues with coronavirus is some of these smaller suppliers will either have to shut down or they can't maintain their business. And all of a sudden, some small widget that's very important part of manufacturing just disappears. So we need to keep the supply chain going too. And so that's the point of that bill. It didn't get a whole lot of traction, but it did have some strong bipartisan support in both the House and Senate. So maybe there's some wiggle room. Maria Cantwell, who is, I don't know at this point whether she's the chair of the Senate Commerce Committee or still the ranking Democrat, because that's still in flux as they get their power sharing agreement ironed out. But the intended heir of the chairmanship, I guess you would say, is, she represents the state of Washington. So manufacturing would be very important to her as well. And she's already said she wants to work with the administration on further aerospace and aviation relief going forward. Some of the other bills, there have been some helicopter bills, helicopter safety. There's one that's tied to the Kobe Bryant crash that would require HTAWs and, I think cockpit voice recording type equipment. And then another one really, really targets the air tour sector of helicopters and would enable or facilitate a lot of restrictions and bans on flights over national parks and a lot of places where you would traditionally see air tours. So that bill, it may not go anywhere, but it shows that there is still a push to restrict operations.
So let's talk about also in Congress on this coming Tuesday, they're going to hold a nomination hearing for Pete Buttigieg, I think. It's hard to pronounce that.
Yeah. Yes, that's right, Chad. So he, late last year, then President-elect Biden had announced his intent to nominate who has been referred to as Mayor Pete, because he was the mayor, served 2 terms as mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He had his confirmation hearing in January, and about a week later, they had a vote on him in the Senate Commerce Committee, and he just sailed through. Now, there was during his confirmation hearing, he had strong bipartisan support. Roger Wicker, who was chairman of the committee, and he's a Republican from Mississippi, called him an outstanding choice and said that he was sure he would be confirmed. And Maria Cantwell had very similar praise. And it was actually a very smooth hearing. A lot of praise showered upon him. They liked the fact that he came in with some infrastructure experience because he had the Smart Streets program. He understands local and state grants. And they also like he's got a pretty good resume. He went to Harvard. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He served in Afghanistan. He's got all the right components. There was a little back and forth because of with Ted Cruz over, and I think a couple of the other senators brought up the highway gas tax because there was some talk about the Highway Trust Fund. And, he did indicate that might need to be looked at. Whether that has impact on aviation and whether down the road they might look at aviation taxes, I don't know. I'm not going to say that means anything. But, and there was some back and forth over the Keystone project, which, wasn't his decision, but it was brought up. But beyond that, it was a pretty smooth hearing, and it was, that praise was reiterated again right before the vote. And I think the final vote was something like 24-3 for his approval in committee. So I could see him pretty much getting through the full Senate pretty easily.
So how would the DOT look under Secretary Buttigieg?
I think the important part of DOT is this is going to be a big year on Capitol Hill for infrastructure. And I think they're really looking at his expertise and background in that area. And the reason being is we're in a down economy. I mean, the Trump administration had referenced infrastructure. Nothing ever really got done. But now we're in a different climate, and in a downturn, nothing gets the economy going as much as infrastructure investments. So there's a lot of motivation from a lot of lawmakers to bring jobs home. And the way you can do that is with infrastructure. So the fact that he has some background and experience on it, I really look to see him taking a lead there. And pushing initiatives. And from an aviation standpoint, that matters because it's airports infrastructure. And airports have received a lot of money. As a matter of fact, some airports have received, somebody said that they've received enough aid that it would be, a couple years worth of budget. But on the other hand, they're losing so much revenue from airlines and concessionaires and everything, that even though the aid might look like a lot, they've really had to look at their entire budget to just maintain afloat. And for general aviation airports, they have not received nearly the amount as the major ones. And they've had concessionaires come to them, and at first it was like, the discussion was, can we put off what we owe you? And sometimes I've been told that those discussions are now turning into, can you forgive us for what we owe you? So, any infrastructure dollars that can go to airports will be a positive thing for aviation.
And I imagine that under a Biden administration, energy is going to be a big part of the transportation department as well, right?
Oh, it already is, Chad. There's been several executive orders already signed on the energy front that clearly shows Biden's view that we want clean energy and we want to make a push away from traditional fossil fuels. And why that matters to aviation, of course, it's a fossil fuel dependent industry. And it's really, if I'm in the aviation industry, I should be on notice that we've got to do everything possible to forward into more sustainable energies. And of course, the business aviation community, they've really tried to get ahead on that. And they've come up with goals and work through ICAO and are really pushing sustainable fuels and pushing electric. So there's a lot to be done. It's just whether the aviation industry's timelines will meet up with the political timeline. So we'll have to see how that plays out. The other thing that we're going to have to pay attention to is perception, because now we've got a huge push towards clean energy. Business jets always get held up as the token populist prop, if you will, of wasted energy and wasted fossil fuels and bad for the environment. And already I think I saw a headline somewhere where John Kerry was being taken to task for having a private jet and yet pushing clean energy. So as a community, they've got to stay on front of this, especially not only because it's, the desire of the administration, but because there's going to be so much attention put on it that it puts business aviation in a little bit more of a vulnerable position.
Is it possible we could see government money going towards research and development or any kind of infrastructure to help with sustainable aviation fuels, which would be the shortest path to reducing emissions from the aviation sector?
Chad, I would imagine so. There already is dollars going towards such research, and we'll take aviation gasoline for instance. There's been money every year poured into looking for an unleaded alternate, and that's one thing I was remiss in not mentioning, that whole issue, because they have not been successful yet in that issue, is going to go back up to the forefront, and they're going to have to really push forward a little bit more quickly than they have. But so yes, there is research and development dollars, and there's strong support for this. So I would not be surprised if we saw it maybe even in airport infrastructure packages, because to move to sustainable fuels, you'll need the infrastructure, but also in the research and development of it as well. Those are two possibilities.
So what else should we keep on the radar for Washington coming ahead?
Well, there are a couple of rules there's several different issues within FAA and rulemaking that you should keep attention to, one of which is the electronic pilot records database. So that rule was at OMB for review. And of course, with the administration changeover, because it didn't get pushed out by the end of last year, it might take a little bit longer, but that was a rule that captured for the first time electronic pilot record keeping requirements for corporate operators to assist the hiring for airline pilots. And the MBAA and the whole business and general aviation community was quite alarmed because it involved requirements that they'd never had to do. And the cost benefit analysis, in their opinion, was not there justifying the new requirements. And plus, it created a whole new category of corporate operator that had never been defined. And they thought it was the wrong place to make such a definition without really vetting it. So that should be out, fairly soon. The other thing to pay attention to is certification. There were rules passed in the a section of the Omnibus Appropriations Act that passed late last year, included a whole section on reforms at FAA. So they're going to have to implement a lot of changes and strengthen oversight and strengthen, their approach to certification. The good thing is that despite all the focus on organization, designation, authorization, ODAs, the bills do not eliminate it, but it certainly, works to eliminate any conflicts of interest. It makes sure FAA stays in control. It requires training and hiring. And so there's going to be a lot of work, and there's going to be intense scrutiny on FAA going forward after the whole, investigations involving the Boeing MAX. The other thing that people should be paying attention to, and particularly preparing for in the Part 135 and 145 community, is looming regulations that's going to mandate SMS. Now, many operators have it, but a lot of the smaller ones don't. And the National Air Transportation Association right now is working with some key operators to do of all different sizes and in different geographic areas, to do kind of a test run to see whether the SMS rules in place for the airlines can apply to smaller operators, and how it does it, and how you can do it where it is effectively implemented without burdening the whole community. And so I've heard everything from an NPRM to a final rule being out next year. So the point is these communities must start preparing, pay attention, and get ready because it's coming.
All right. Thanks, Kerry. Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.